Hey guys, thanks for joining me on this journey of joy, grief, and authenticity. I want to talk a little bit about my experience going back to work after I had my daughter Hollis, and she died after 6 days, and it was a complete shock. And so there was some trauma involved. And I want to talk a little bit about what it's been like to go back to the office and go back to life. So I went back to work after 6 weeks, I believe. I had some maternity leave to take, but interesting note, when you've lost your child, you do not get to take your full maternity leave, which is because of practical reasons. You get time off to actually let your body recover, and you can to continue to take that time off. So that was my experience, is that I took my 6 weeks off because my body was healing, basically. But then the rest of the time I was going to take off was to bond with the baby. And so that was, I saw it coming, but it was still painful to hear when you make the phone call and you realize that your scenario is such that you don't get to take the rest of the time off because there's not a baby to bond with. I work at a great company, lots and lots of colleagues, lots of support. And, but it's hard going back to work either way. I can't imagine being a manager of somebody like me who is emotional, and I am pretty open with my emotions, clearly. And so I can't imagine what it's like, and there's no way you can really prepare for something like this with your team, because everybody does it so differently and everybody grieves so differently. And some people might have preferred to have come back to work immediately. And it was really good for me to go back to work. I definitely needed to return to work, but I kind of wish I would have gone back part-time for a while, simply because I didn't have a lot to offer, and it was very hard to get through a work day. And what I mean by that is it was really hard to concentrate, and it was really hard to focus on anything, to motivate myself. It's still very hard to motivate myself. I have to go to great lengths in comparison to other times in my life. It was also difficult to be around people constantly, and it was really exhausting. And so I always felt like my head was swimming, and then I would go back to my car at lunch and I would take naps. And I'd done this a little bit when I was pregnant because I was so tired just as a pregnant person. But then after I came back from and was grieving, I absolutely needed time to reboot. And so it would have been, I work in a cube environment with lots of people around, and so I needed time by myself. And I definitely think that was helpful for me. That was definitely the smart move for me, to always take some time to myself at lunch. And that's why we have lunch hours. That's why we have break times. And I needed it maybe more than I ever did during that time. I will say that if you are managing somebody who is grieving, there's probably all kinds of advice out there, so take mine with a grain of salt. But I would recommend being flexible and understanding that grief is sporadic. It can't be scheduled. These people are not sleeping at night in a lot of cases, and so they are maybe operating in zombie form a little bit, and they might just need to call in sick, and it's for nothing other than deep, deep sadness. And I think that that's a good reason to be sick. I'm the kind of person that I truly never physically get that ill, so I can count on probably one hand the number of times that I've called in sick. And so for me, there was a day or two in there where and literally just a day or two where I called in and was like, I'm not going to be any good to anybody today. So that I would just recommend to expect that from somebody and give them the grace and the opportunity to do that. I also worked in an environment, and I still do work in a world where, like I said, we're in cubes and everybody can see you. So there's no real opportunity to hide your emotion. So for me, I had to pass by 3 or 4 people every time I needed to go to the bathroom because I was crying. And there was no real way to hide that. I work in a really large organization. I believe there are about 3,000 employees that work on our campus. And so you see a lot of faces every day. And being pregnant is a pretty obvious thing. So a lot of people know you're pregnant and they're asking how your pregnancy is going. And when you return to work, they're asking how the baby is. And that was a big shock for me. And it was a big shock for my colleagues because they had gone to great lengths to make sure that I didn't receive those types of questions. And they tried to socialize my story in advance so that I wasn't dealing with that type of thing. But when there's just so many people and you just don't know who all might ask those questions. And I believe I received that question. We lost Hollis in May, and I received that question in January or February. So it was at least over half a year of receiving questions like that. And they got less and less common, but it goes to show just how stories like this are not stories that people want to convey and talk about a whole lot. And so it's really hard to disseminate that message. And me personally, I wanted people to know. A lot of people would maybe not want anybody to know the story. But I did learn to perfect my response, and that was because oftentimes you'd be on an elevator and you have about 9 seconds to tell somebody the saddest story they've ever heard. And I learned to say, actually I have a lot to update you on. I'll send you an email, and thanks for asking. And that's whenever I'm able to convey in an email, Hollis's story. And that I probably truthfully only did that a couple times because it took me by surprise every time somebody asked. And but again, when you're pregnant, people see and they know. And so whenever you're back after a real long pregnancy, they want to ask you that question, that kind of question that anybody would. And so that was difficult for me because then, it just gets your mind thinking about everything that you've experienced, and it becomes really hard to focus on work again. And the problem with stuff like that is that if a trigger happens, you don't know if it's just going to take you down a road where you are done for the day and there is no good you are going to bring the company after that conversation. So that's tricky. I will say I had the best colleagues because the day I arrived back at work, they very, very thoughtfully asked me, they told me all the different ways that they could have, we thought about doing this and we thought about doing that and we thought about putting up pictures because we thought you'd want to see her, or pictures of your new puppy. And we just couldn't decide what to do. So we just thought we'd wait and we would ask you, what do you want to do? Do you want to talk about it? Do you want to not talk about it? What do you want to do? We will do anything you want to do. And that was perfect. And so I had the opportunity to then say, thank you. Please do not ignore the elephant in the room. I would love to talk about it. I would love to know that you guys are comfortable with letting me talk about it and that I'm not making you feel uncomfortable. And so that was the best response. And I don't think I've ever heard of anybody doing that before, but it was exactly what I needed in that moment. So I'm in communications at work, and part of those communications is a really fun little piece where I get to broadcast the news to our employees across the state. And it's so fun. Me and my colleague get to do this. It's just the best. And I had continued to grow a little larger behind the desk whenever I was pregnant. And I really wanted people to know, one, why I was going to be disappearing from the broadcast, but two, why I was so fat. And I wanted people to know, like, I'm pregnant. But it was kind of hard to see behind the desk. You could just see, like, my general body growing. And so we had made that announcement before I left on maternity leave. And so even more people knew that I was pregnant. And the beautiful part is that whenever I came back to work, my colleagues let me use that as a platform to share Hollis's story. And so I briefly got to talk about what it was like to, about Hollis's story, but also how the person next to you might be going through something you just don't know about. And that it is, have some grace for them and ask them. I told the story about how my colleagues had asked, what do I want? And I mentioned that, we all have a different story that we're bringing to work every day. And that was a beautiful opportunity, and I really, really appreciated that I didn't have to hide one of the biggest things that had ever happened to me in my life. One of the things that I also thought was really crazy was I feel pretty certain that I was walking around in shock for the first couple months, and that meant that I was back at work by the time I felt the shock starting to wear off. And I specifically remember being in sitting in a stall in the bathroom at work. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. I can't believe this is my life. This has happened to me. I have lost Hollis. This is real. And oh my goodness, this is my life. And it was very much a moment of, holy crap, what just happened? And all of those, I believe I was, that was 2 weeks back at work when I recognized that and really started to sense the shock wearing off. I can't imagine somebody who's lost a spouse and has to come back to work after a few days, and what that must be like, and how difficult it must be to function and to have a routine because your life is rocked. And sometimes you don't necessarily have to talk about, to really call out what they've been through. You can be a little bit more discreet, but acknowledge that they've been through a lot. I think for me, that was most important. I didn't want somebody to ignore what had happened. I needed somebody to just be like, hey, I've been thinking about you a lot. I hope you're doing okay. Or asking them to go to lunch. And if you do, be prepared that they might really want to talk about it. Otherwise, they would rather be sleeping in their car. True story. Thanks for joining me on my journey of joy, grief, and authenticity. And thanks for hearing me out about what it's like to go back to work after a really difficult loss. And I just encourage you to show a lot of grace to somebody in your life, a colleague that may be experiencing loss, and remember, it's not just the first week or two. Their grief will go on for a long time, and their work, their capacity to be the kind of employee they were before might look a little different. But don't give up on them, because they may be an even more amazing person afterwards because they've experienced something really difficult. And so I have a lot of appreciation for the people in my life at work who have believed in me and known that I may be going through a difficult time, but I still have a lot to offer our organization. And I feel valued. And so I hope that you can help your colleagues feel valued even when they're going through really emotional and difficult times in life.